Chapter 34. And at the end, they traveled again. There was a time when Arthur Dent would not. He said that the bistropathic drive had revealed to him that time and distance were one, that mind and universe were one, that perception and reality were one, and that the more one traveled, the more one stayed in one place, and that what with one thing and another, he would rather just stay put for a while and sort it all out in his mind, which was now at one with the universe, so it shouldn't take too long, and he could get a good rest afterward. Put in a little flying practice and learn to cook, which he had always meant to do. The can of Greek olive oil was now his most prized possession, and he said that the way it had unexpectedly turned up in his life had again given him a certain sense of the oneness of things, which made him feel that. He yawned and fell asleep. In the morning, as they prepared to take him to some quiet and idyllic planet where they wouldn't mind his talking like that, they suddenly picked up a computer-driven distress call and diverted to investigate. A small, but apparently undamaged spacecraft of the Meridia class seemed to be dancing a strange little jig through the void. A brief computer scan revealed that the ship was fine, its computer was fine, but that its pilot was mad. Half mad, the man insisted as they carried him raving aboard. He was a journalist with the sidereal Daily Mentioner. They sedated him and sent Marvin in to keep him company until he promised to try to talk sense. I was covering a trial, he said at last, on arquebuthon. He pushed himself up onto his thin and wasted shoulders. His eyes stared wildly. His white hair seemed to be waving at someone it knew in the next room. Easy, easy, said Ford. Trillian put a soothing hand on his shoulder. The man sank back down again and stared at the ceiling of the ship's sickbay. The case, he said, is now immaterial, but there was a witness, a man called Prack, a strange and difficult man. They were eventually forced to administer a drug to make him tell the truth, a truth drug. His eyes rolled helplessly in his head. They gave him too much, he said in a tiny whimper. They gave him much too much. He started to cry. I think the robots must have jogged the surgeon's arm. Robots? Asked Zaphod sharply. What robots? Some white robots, whispered the man hoarsely. Broke into the courtroom and stole the judge's scepter, the arquebuthon scepter of justice. Nasty plastic thing. I don't know why they wanted it. He began to cry again. And I think they jogged the surgeon's arm. He shook his head loosely from side to side, helplessly, sadly, his eyes screwed up in pain. And when the trial continued, he said in a weeping whisper, they asked Prack a most unfortunate thing. They asked him, he paused and shivered, to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, only, don't you see? He suddenly hoisted himself up onto his elbows again and shouted at them, they'd given him too much of the drug. He collapsed again, moaning quietly, much too, much too, much too, much too. The group gathered around his bedside, glanced at one another. There were goosebumps on backs. What happened? Said Zaphod at last. Oh, he told it all right, said the man savagely. For all I know, he's still telling it now. Strange, terrible things, terrible, terrible, he screamed. They tried to calm him, but he struggled to his elbows again. Terrible things, incomprehensible things, he shouted. Things that would drive a man mad. He stared wildly at them. Or in my case, half mad. I'm a journalist. You mean, said Arthur quietly, that you are used to confronting the truth. No, said the man with a puzzled frown. I mean that I made an excuse and left early. He collapsed into a coma, from which he recovered only once and briefly. On that one occasion, they discovered from him the following. When it became clear what was happening, and as it became clear that Prack could not be stopped, that here was truth in its absolute and final form, the court was cleared. Not only cleared, it was sealed up with Prack still in it. Steel walls were erected around it, and, just to be on the safe side, barbed wire, electric fences, crocodile swamps, and 3 major armies were installed so that no one would ever have to hear Prax speak. "That's a pity," said Arthur. "I'd like to hear what he has to say. Presumably he would know what the question to the ultimate answer is. It always bothered me that we never found out." "Think of a number," said the computer. "Any number." Arthur told the computer the telephone number of King's Cross Railway Station passenger inquiries, on the grounds that it must have been some function, and this might turn out to be it. The computer injected the number into the ship's reconstituted improbability drive. In relativity, matter tells space how to curve, and space tells matter how to move. The heart of gold told space to get knotted, and parked itself neatly within the inner steel perimeter of the Argibuthon chamber of law. The courtroom was an austere place, a large, dark chamber, clearly designed for justice rather than, for instance, pleasure. You wouldn't hold a dinner party there, at least not a successful one. The decor would get your guests down. The ceilings were high, vaulted, and very dark. Shadows lurked there with grim determination. The paneling for the walls and benches, the cladding of the heavy pillars, all were carved from the darkest and most severe trees in the fearsome forest of Argilbard. The massive black podium of justice, which dominated the center of the chamber, was a monster of gravity. If a sunbeam had ever managed to slink this far into the justice complex of Argibuthon, it would have turned around and slunk straight back out again. Arthur and Trillian were the first in, while Ford and Zaphod bravely kept a watch on their rear. At first, it seemed totally dark and deserted. Their footsteps echoed hollowly around the chamber. This seemed curious. All the defenses were still in position and operative around the outside of the building. They had run scan checks. Therefore, they had assumed the truth-telling must still be going on. But there was nothing. Then, as their eyes became accustomed to the darkness, they spotted a dull red glow in a corner. And behind the glow, a live shadow. They swung a flashlight round onto it. Prack was lounging on a bench, smoking a listless cigarette. "Hi," he said, with a little wave. His voice echoed through the chamber. He was a little man with scraggy hair. He sat with his shoulders hunched forward, and his head and knees kept jiggling. He took a drag off his cigarette. They stared at him. "What's going on?" said Trillian. "Nothing," said the man, and jiggled his shoulders. Arthur shone his flashlight full on Prack's face. "We thought," he said, "that you were meant to be telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." "Oh, that," said Prack. "Yeah, I was. I finished. There's not nearly as much of it as people imagine. Some of it's pretty funny, though." He suddenly exploded into about 3 seconds of maniacal laughter and stopped again. He sat there, jiggling his head and knees. He dragged on his cigarette with a strange half-smile. Ford and Zaphod came forward out of the shadows. "Tell us about it," said Ford. "Oh, I don't remember any of it now," said Prack. "I thought of writing some of it down, but at first I couldn't find a pencil, and then I thought, why bother?" There was a long silence, during which they thought they could feel the universe age a little. Prack stared into the light. "None of it?" said Arthur at last. "You can remember none of it?" "No, except most of the good bits were about frogs. I remember that." Suddenly, he was hooting with laughter again and stamping his feet on the ground. "You would not believe some of the things about frogs. Come on, let's go out and find ourselves a frog. Boy, will I ever see them in a new light." He leapt to his feet and did a tiny little dance. Then he stopped and took a long drag at his cigarette. "Let's find a frog I can laugh at," he said simply. "Anyway, who are you guys?" "We came to find you," said Trillian, deliberately not keeping disappointment out of her voice. "My name is Trillian." Prack jiggled his head. "Ford Prefect," said Ford Prefect with a shrug. Prack jiggled his head. "And I," said Zaphod, when he judged that the silence was once again deep enough to allow an announcement of such gravity to be tossed in lightly, am Zaphod Beeblebrox. Prack jiggled his head. Who's this guy? Said Prack, jiggling his shoulder. Arthur, who was standing silent for a moment, lost in disappointed thoughts. Me? Said Arthur. Oh, my name's Arthur Dent. Prack's eyes popped out of his head. No kidding, he yelped. You are Arthur Dent? The Arthur Dent? He staggered backward, clutching his stomach and convulsed with fresh paroxysms of laughter. Hey, just think of meeting you, he gasped. Boy, you are the most, wow, you just leave the frogs standing. He howled and screamed with laughter, then fell over backwards onto the bench. He hollered and yelled in hysterics. He cried with laughter, kicking his legs in the air. He beat his chest. Gradually, he subsided, panting. He looked at them. He looked at Arthur. He fell back again, howling with laughter. Eventually, everyone fell asleep. Eventually, he fell asleep. Arthur stood there with his lips twitching while the others carried Prack comatose onto the ship. Before we picked up Prack, said Arthur, I was going to leave. I still want to, and I think I should do so as soon as possible. The others nodded in silence, a silence only undermined by the heavily muffled and distant sound of hysterical laughter that came drifting from Prack's cabin at the farthest end of the ship. We have questioned him, continued Arthur, or at least you have questioned him. I, as you know, can't go near him, on everything. And he really doesn't seem to have anything to contribute, just the occasional snippet and things I don't wish to hear about frogs. The others tried not to smirk. Now, I am the first to appreciate a joke, said Arthur, and then had to wait for the others to stop laughing. I am the first, he stopped again. This time he stopped and listened to the silence. There actually was silence this time, and it had come very suddenly. Prack was quiet. For days they had lived with constant maniacal laughter ringing around the ship, only occasionally relieved by short periods of light giggling and sleep. Arthur's very soul was clenched with paranoia. This was not the silence of sleep. A buzzer sounded. A glance at the board told him that the buzzer had been sounded by Prack. He's not well, said Trillian quietly. The constant laughing is completely wrecking his body. Arthur's lips twitched, but he said nothing. We'd better go and see him, said Trillian. Trillian came out of the cabin wearing her serious face. He wants you to go in, she said to Arthur, who was wearing his glum and tight-lipped one. He thrust his hands deep into his dressing gown pockets and tried to think of something to say which wouldn't sound petty. It seemed terribly unfair, but he couldn't. Please, said Trillian. He shrugged and went in, taking his glum and tight-lipped face with him, despite the reaction this always provoked from Prack. He looked down at his tormentor, who was lying quietly on the bed, ashen and wasted. His breathing was very shallow. Ford and Zaphod were standing by the bed, looking awkward. You wanted to ask me something? Said Prack in a thin voice and coughed slightly. Just the cough made Arthur stiffen, but it passed and subsided. How do you know that? He asked. Prack shrugged weakly. 'Cause it's true, he said simply. Arthur took the point. Yes, he said, at last, in a rather strange drawl. I did have a question, or rather, what I actually have is an answer. I wanted to know what the question was. Park nodded sympathetically, and Arthur relaxed a little. It's a long story, he said. But the question I would like to know is the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. All we know about it is that the answer is 42, which is a little aggravating. Prack nodded again. 42, he said. Yes, that's right. He paused. Shadows of thought and memory crossed his face like the shadows of clouds crossing the land. I'm afraid, he said at last, that the answer and the question are mutually exclusive. Knowledge of one logically precludes knowledge of the other. It is impossible that both can ever be known about the same universe. He paused again. Disappointment crept into Arthur's face and snuggled down into its accustomed place. Except, said Prack, struggling to sort a thought out, if it happened, it seems that the answer and the question would just cancel each other out and take the universe with them. which would then be replaced by something even more bizarrely inexplicable. It is possible that this has already happened, he added with a weak smile, but there's a certain amount of uncertainty about it. A little giggle brushed through him. Arthur sat down on a stool. Oh, well, he said with resignation, I was just hoping there would be some sort of reason. Do you know, said Prack, the story of the reason? Arthur said he didn't, and Prack said that he knew that he didn't. He told it. One night, he said, a spaceship appeared in the sky of a planet that had never seen one before. That planet was Dalforsos. The ship was this one. It appeared as a brilliant new star moving silently across the heavens. Primitive tribesmen who were sitting huddled on the cold hillsides looked up from their steaming night drinks and pointed with trembling fingers and swore that they had seen a sign from their gods that meant that they must now arise at last and go and slay the evil princes of the plains. In the high turrets of their palaces, the princes of the plains looked up and saw the shining star and received it unmistakably as a sign from their gods that they must go and attack the accursed tribesmen of the cold hillsides. And between them, the dwellers in the forest looked up into the sky and saw the sign of the new star, and saw it with fear and apprehension, for though they had never seen anything like it before, they too knew precisely what it foreshadowed, and they bowed their heads in despair. They knew that when the rains came, it was a sign. When the rains departed, it was a sign. When the winds rose, it was a sign. When the winds fell, it was a sign. When in the land there was born at the midnight of a full moon a goat with 3 heads, that was a sign. When in the land there was born at some time in the afternoon a perfectly normal cat or pig with no birth complications, or even just a child with a retrousse nose, that too would often be taken as a sign. So there was no doubt at all that a new star in the sky was a sign of a particularly spectacular order. And each new sign signified the same thing, that the princes of the plains and the tribesmen of the cold hillsides were about to beat the hell out of each other again. This in itself wouldn't be so bad, except the princes of the plains and the tribesmen of the cold hillsides always elected to beat the hell out of each other in the forest. And it was always the dwellers in the forest who came off worst in these exchanges, though as far as they could see it never had anything to do with them. And sometimes, after some of the worst of these outrages, the dwellers in the forest would send a messenger to either the leader of the princes of the plains or the leader of the tribesmen of the cold hillsides and demand to know the reason for this intolerable behavior. And the leader, whichever one it was, would take the messenger aside and explain the reason to him, slowly and carefully, and with great attention to the considerable detail involved. And the terrible thing was, it was a very good one. It was very clear, very rational, and tough. The messenger would hang his head and feel sad and foolish that he had not realized what a tough and complex place the real world was, and what difficulties and paradoxes had to be embraced if one was to live in it. Now do you understand? The leader would say. The messenger would nod dumbly. And you see these battles have to take place. Another dumb nod. And why they have to take place in the forest, and why it is in everybody's best interest, the forest dwellers included, that they should, in the long run, yes? And the messenger did understand the reason, and he returned to his people in the forest. But as he approached them, as he walked through the forest and among the trees, he found that all he could remember of the reason was how terribly clear the argument had seemed. What it actually was, he couldn't remember at all. And this, of course, was a great comfort when next the tribesmen and the princes came hacking and burning their way through the forest, killing every forest dweller in their way. Prack paused in his story and coughed pathetically. I was the messenger, he said, after the battles precipitated by the appearance of your ship, which were particularly savage. Many of our people died. I thought I could bring the reason back. I went and was told it by the leader of the princes, but on the way back it slipped and melted away in my mind like snow in the sun. That was many years ago, and much has happened since then. He looked up at Arthur and giggled again very gently. There is one other thing I can remember from the truth drug, apart from the frogs, and that is God's last message to his creation. Would you like to hear it? For a moment, didn't know whether to take him seriously. It's true. For real, I mean it. His chest heaved weakly, and he struggled for breath. His head lolled slightly. I wasn't very impressed with it when I first knew what it was, he said. But now I think back to how impressed I was by the prince's reason, and how soon afterward I couldn't recall it at all. I think it might be a lot more helpful. Would you like to know what it is? Would you? They nodded dumbly. I bet you would. If you're interested, I suggest you go and look for it. It is written in 30-foot high letters of fire on top of the Quintelis Quigsgar Mountains in the lands of Sorbupsuri on the planet Preliminarium Tarn, third out from the sun's arse in galactic center QQ7, active J Gamma. It is guarded by the majestic Montrachel of Mob. There was a long silence following this announcement, which was finally broken by Arthur. Sorry, it's where? He said. It is written, repeated Park, in 30-foot high letters of fire on top of the Quintalis Quasgar Mountains in the land of Serbopstory on the planet Plimertarn, third out from the. Sorry, said Arthur again. Which mountains? The Quintalis Quasgar Mountains in the land of Serbopstory on the planet. Which land was that? I didn't quite catch it. Sevastopol on the planet, or what? Oh, for heaven's sake, said Prack, and died testily. In the following days, Arthur thought a little about this message, but in the end he decided he was not going to allow himself to be drawn by it, and insisted on following his original plan of finding a nice little world somewhere to settle down and lead a quiet, retired life. Having saved the universe twice in one day, he thought he could take things a little easier from now on. They dropped him off on the planet Cricket, which was now once again a pleasant, idyllic, pastoral world, even if the songs did occasionally get on his nerves. He spent a lot of time flying. He learned to communicate with birds and discovered their conversation was fantastically boring. It was all to do with wind speed, wingspans, power to weight ratios, and a fair bit about berries. Unfortunately, he discovered, once you have learned bird speak, you quickly come to realize that the air is full of it the whole time. Just inane bird chatter. There is no getting away from it. For that reason, Arthur eventually gave up the sport and learned to live on the ground and love it, despite the inane chatter he heard down there as well. One day, he was walking through the fields humming a ravishing tune he heard recently when a silver spaceship descended from the sky and landed in front of him. A hatchway opened, a ramp extended, and a tall, gray-green alien marched out and approached him. Arthur Phillip, it said, then glanced sharply at him and down at his clipboard. It frowned. It looked up at him again. I've done you before, haven't I? It said. The end.